Bueno, creo que estamos listos para comenzar.
Okay.
Welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to this keynote by Jaime Saavedra. Jaime is in education really at heart. His mother was a teacher. He has been a university professor many times in his career. He has worked at the World Bank, always connected to poverty reduction and to education. And he currently directs the education group at the bank. He's also a very good friend of this program. He's always been very generous when I've invited him to come and speak in classes or to students. So we are so honored to have you, Jaime, and so grateful that you agreed to do this for us at a time when I know there are so many demands on your time because of this crisis on a Saturday morning. So without further introduction, over to you. Please join me in giving Jaime a warm welcome.
So thank you very much, Fernando. Unfortunately, I can only see me, and I cannot see you or the at this stage or the participants. But extremely happy to be here and to join you in celebrating the work of your students of the International Education Policy Program of the last 20 years. I've enjoyed participating in several events during the last years. I learned a lot when talking to you and your students. I received a couple of weeks ago, a book that compiles a lot of the work that your students have been doing in the last during these last months. Obviously, I haven't finished the book. If I have to devote myself to read the books that Fernando sends me, I would just that will occupy all my time. So that's kind of impossible. An impossible task. So, but it's a great compilation that of a lot of stuff that's happening now of people like who's now in the screen and in this call, trying to do as much as we can in order to try to cope with this dramatic crisis that we're living. I just want to confirm that, can you see my screen now, Fernando?
Yes, I can see it. Can everybody else see it? Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, we can see it. Great, excellent. So, and actually it's related to all that work that everyone is doing that I want to spend some time with you discussing what's going on and what to do, right? And what's a little bit about the magnitude of this immense crisis that we're living and what we can do about it. Let me see, hopefully this works. Yep. So look, before COVID hit, we were already saying, if we were having this talk 6 months ago, I would have already said, look, we're living a learning crisis. We're off track reaching the SDG4s. We live in an education systems with extreme inequality opportunities. And I would have said the goal of our work is that we need to have a better, more inclusive education systems. But now that goalpost has moved, and we're dealing with a huge crisis that you know that better than me. I just want to emphasize when we talk about this shock to education, that this phenomenal shock, that this is the largest shock for education in the last 100 years, it's really a combination of two things that we have never lived at the same time. So we have these extended school closures, which have happened in the past, right? In all countries, there have been strikes, there have been political issues that have interrupted the school year. We have lived that, not that long, and we have the deepest possible economic recession that we can think about. Now, we have had sharp economic recessions before. Yes, we have had, but we've never had the two things at the same time. These long economic closures, and now the systems need more resources in order to recover themselves and to accelerate learning. At that same moment, we have a huge, deep recession that will hit public budgets and will hit the possibility of families to invest in education. So we really need to have aggressive policy responses, because if not, the shocks will have permanent effects on human capital, on learning and schooling attainment, foundational skills. And we're really worried because education is at its heart human connections. And despite the efforts that countries are having, those connections are not happening. Despite the fact, great, we can have the possibility of having this connection now, but that's not something that will replace the human interaction. But first, very quickly, where were countries heading before the pandemic hit? And remember that SDG 4 says that by 2030, we need to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, quality primary and secondary education, right? So even before this pandemic, I mean, were we going to attain that, right? All kids in school, all kids in primary and secondary education, and enjoying quality education. Well, that was not going to happen already. We knew that. I mean, that target of the SDG 4 was not going to happen. We know before the crisis that access is not an issue of improving quality only. Still, access is a challenge. 260 million kids are not in school. The percentage of kids who are not in school, who should be either in primary or secondary education, who should be in school, are not in school. That's a quarter of the kids in sub-Saharan Africa. So the quantity issue has not been solved. But then we knew that there was the quality issue. And to try to combine two things in a very simple way is that we came up with this indicator that, and I shared with some of your students, Fernando, last year. I mean, part of this presentation, we came with this indicator called learning poverty. That is the share of children who cannot read and understand a simple text by age 10. Why this indicator? I mean, we already had PISA, TEAMS, PEARLS, we have national assessments. So there's a lot of data, not enough, but there's a lot of data out there. But we want to use that information and compile it and put it in one single indicator that will be easy to understand. And that key issue of being easy to understand is absolutely essential, because I'm not sure that everyone understands that we're living a learning crisis. And I'm also not sure that everyone is understanding the magnitude of the crisis that we're living in. I mean, talking about people outside the education community. So the attempt here is to reach not you, actually, at the end of the day, not people who are in the education community, but to reach the broad policy making community, and eventually to reach everyone, to reach every parent and every teacher. Because we can ask any parent, can your child read and understand a simple text, your 10-year-old? And notice that this is a very low bar, right? Reading and understanding a simple text by age 10 is a low bar. I mean, those of you who've had kids, I mean, you want them to read a short novel by that age. But sticking to that low bar, right? What percentage of kids can read and understand a simple text? The number that we had was 53% in low and middle income countries, right? That's a tragedy, right? Half of the kids, most of them in school, some of them not even in school, but the majority in school, they cannot read and understand a simple text. I mean, some of them can read something, some of them can read words, maybe a sentence, but they can understand what they cannot understand what they are reading, and others cannot read at all. So that is, I would say, and that was before the crisis, I'm sorry, before this pandemic, that was already a crisis. And actually that number was not the same everywhere. That 53% was an average of 21% in East Asia and the Pacific, which includes China, right? Which has a learning poverty below 20%. Latin America, it's kind of in the middle of the pack, right? 50%, half of children in Latin America, half of 10-year-olds cannot read and understand a text. The numbers is close to 90% in sub-Saharan Africa. That's an immensely large number. So this is just for all to, you have seen people like you have seen numbers like this before, but it's just, I mean, always we need to internalize the magnitude of the problem that we are facing. Now, one thing that I always wanted to, that I spent 1 minute is saying why reading, because I mean, learning is a holistic process, and we're going to mention that later. The learning process is not only about academics, it's about social emotional skills, etc. But reading is fundamental. Everybody understands that children must learn to read, because actually learning to read is the basis to learning many other things, right? It's a crucial gateway for further learning. Is a foundation for many other skills, right? Upon which other skills are built. And then we said, why at age 10? What a certain age? Because children who don't read by late primary find it very hard to catch up, right? And really risk lagging behind. So it's not like, well, it's not at age 10, it was going to be at age 15, and that will be fine. No, it will not be fine, right? It is really a tragedy that it's not happening at the right time. And now, and also empirically, happens to be that reading is highly correlated with other skills that we care about, with math, science. For those in those countries for which we have data, it is correlated with math, science. It is also correlated for those fewer countries for which we have data with key social emotional skills like self-regulation, critical thinking, etc. So in that sense, I mean, even if it's could sound like we're focusing on only one simple and indicator, that it's that it doesn't cover all the aspects that we care about education. I think the beauty of it is that it's critical, it's a foundation for everything else, and everyone will be able to understand what we're talking about. Now, what happens after COVID? That 53 now might be 63%. That 53% that we had before the crisis implied that we had already a very large homework, right? So imagine that you were saying, well, today we're at 53%. Eventually, if we wanted to have SDG 4, right, by 2030, which means quality primary education, if everyone has quality primary education, obviously the learning poverty will be zero, right? All kids who should be, if you have quality primary education, you should be able to read and understand the text at the end of primary. So then that 53 should have gone down. And that's the path that we wanted to chart, right? Until 2030 and set a target. And we set a target that we should be able to have that 50, at least reduced by half, that 53% between today and 2030. Unfortunately, and that's even to compound in the tragedy, the current simulations that we have are that 53 could shoot up to 63% as a consequence of this pandemic. So if we were saying, well, we needed to accelerate in order to move that learning poverty down, now the homework is much more complicated. One reason, and I forget to say that, one reason why we use that term learning poverty is because we wanted to reflect the fact that that number should be zero, right? Learning poverty is like extreme poverty, should be zero. Hunger should be zero, right? And actually it is zero in some countries, right? So in Singapore, in Estonia, in Finland is 1 or 2 or 3%, right? Even in Vietnam is in the single digits, right? So it's not that it's impossible to eliminate learning poverty. It is possible. Many countries have done it, right? Unfortunately, a huge swaths of the planet have not done it. So we do have a huge homework, and unfortunately, this homework seems to be much more complex now. This is basically the same data that I showed you before. It's like this is 53 out of these little people in green are those who are learning poor. Part of those in the top, I don't know if you can see my cursor, part of those in the top are kids who are not even in school, but most of them are in school, right? But are learning poor, right? They cannot read and understand the text. This set of kids is those additional 10 percentage points that can move into learning poverty that before were in white, before were not learning poor. So so this is a phenomenal impact. Now, if we see where is the learning poverty might be increasing more, it seems that it's going to be hitting more middle income countries, more than low income countries, because learning poverty was already very high in low income countries. If we see that by regions, you see that, and this is the pessimistic scenario. Actually, these 10 points. This is the world. So the world is increasing learning poverty in 10 points. That number is 16 points in South Asia, in the South Asia region, and 12 points in Latin America. So larger increases in this region, smaller increases in Sub-Saharan Africa, only five points. But remember, Sub-Saharan Africa was already at 87% of learning poor. So now, some people have asked, but look, you have here several scenarios, an intermediate, a pessimistic, and an optimistic scenarios. And these different scenarios of increases in learning poverty depend on the extent of the school closures, and it depend on the extent of the effectiveness, right, of the coping mechanisms that countries are implementing, which we're going to talk a little bit more in the next few minutes. Um, However, unfortunately, the data that starts coming up in terms of the effectiveness of the coping mechanisms is not that great. School closures are unfortunately been longer than what we thought initially. You have very large portions of Latin America and South Asia that have not opened yet. Some parts of East Asia also have not opened. Only OECD countries are on, and countries in Europe and Central Asia seem to be opening faster. So both elements allow us to think that most likely we're going to be in the pessimistic scenario, unfortunately. Um, there are some other more complex calculations because there's a more complex analysis about what's happening with those kids who were already learning poor, right? So kids in Sub-Saharan Africa, do you remember I was saying 87% cannot read and understand a text. They are learning poor. The number is going up from 87 to 92. That's a tragedy already. But those who were already learning poor, right, might be also forgetting a lot of that small knowledge that they already had, right? And their human capital might be deteriorating. So even if they were able to read a sentence or read some words, maybe they might be losing that. And this learning gap, which is the average distance of students to the minimum proficiency, see its greatly increase in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America. So this looking at the learning poor already, even them, they are having, are losing part of the skills that they already had. Now, with the other big issue that worries us a lot is that within countries, the deterioration of learning, the dropout rates, all the negative effects that we see on education might be larger for the poor than for the rich. And this is a simulation that we did for in the case of Colombia. And what you have there in the green line are the bottom quintile, the poorest, and the yellow line is the richest. And actually, this is how much is the learning losses compared to the baseline pre-pandemic or the end of the last academic year, depending on how long is the extent of the school closures. And the longest the longest the school closures, obviously, the larger the losses, the learning losses. But those learning losses are larger for the bottom quintile than for the richest quintile. And we have also done, working with UNICEF, some simulations about what's the who are those students who are not being reached, right, by the typical coping mechanisms that countries are following, mostly remote learning. And if you see these yellow bars, the dark yellow is the rural, the light yellow is urban. So most of the losses are urban kids. When you see these blue lines, is differentiating the poorest, the bottom 40% and the richer 60%. So most of those who are not being reached are among the poorest the bottom 40%. And actually, we don't see differences between boys and girls, right? But clearly, the poor are not being reached are disproportionately not being reached compared to the rich. Now, there are many crucial areas at stake. We have seen that average schooling adjusted for quality will be going down more than 7. Actually, the last simulation, it's between 8 and 10 million children might not return to school. We have done an analysis about if given this learning poverty, given this reduction in years of schooling, given the dropout rates, what is the potential loss in terms of future lifetime earnings of this generation, not of the economy as a whole, but of this generation, and these children and young people who are not going to school stand to lose 10 trillion in future lifetime earnings. Those 10 trillion is equivalent to 8% of global GDP. So that's a huge number. And just think, I mean, this loss of earnings for this generation is to exactly the same generation that will be paying the debts that all countries are incurring in order to finance the pandemic, right? Which is natural. I mean, you have a war, you enter into fiscal deficits. All countries are doing that. That's what has to happen. But then those deficits imply debt that has to be paid, right? In all countries, rich and poor, right? But who's the generation who will pay in the next 20 and 30 years is that generation who today is in school. And also, I mean, there are huge social, emotional, and mental health costs. So we really are in a complex situation. Now, what to do? How to act? Right? And here in this slide, I'm putting a little bit of what's the homework of countries, or what's the countries are trying to do, right? And we have and this in a way also reflects the works that people at the World Bank is doing with the different governments across the world. I mean, there's a set of activities of what to do just to cope with the crisis while kids are not in school, how to manage the continuity process, and then how to improve and accelerate, right? And there is that we think is can we really seize this opportunity? Is the future coming faster? So if I start with the coping, well, what most countries are doing are multimodal distance learning, right? That we're gonna talk a little bit about that in a second. And that's great. I mean, it's great that the majority of countries have really taken seriously remote learning, and that remote learning has to be multimodal because with internet, you only reach a fraction of the students. So countries are really investing, and you know that well, in this combination of internet, TV, radio, WhatsApp. I mean, TV is back, educational TV is back in many countries. Teachers are using intensively WhatsApp. It's an interesting combination of using different modes, different platforms. So some content is being delivered through TV and radio, while the teachers can communicate through WhatsApp with their students. Something that is very taxing for teachers. It is not easy, it's complicated, but many teachers are doing that. So, I mean, there is movement. Obviously, that movement is not the same in all countries, and it's not the same for all kids, right? I mean, still, I mean, more kids will have a smartphone than having a laptop or internet connection, but not all kids will have a smartphone either. So yes, countries are reaching with TV, but obviously there will be some learning watching TV, but it's obviously not the same as being at home, I'm sorry, in school. But I mean, but there is a lot of activity on that. Now countries, many of them are moving to the managed continuity phase, right? I mean, starting to experiment with blended multimodal remote learning. So continue remote learning, but in some countries, like going at least partially to school, investing in safe school operations. We see modifications in the school calendar, changes in the curriculum, but extremely heterogeneous in terms of intensity of these efforts in the different countries. And the key thing is that how to enter then an improving and accelerating phase, right, in which you can see some of the investments that are happening today as opportunities for reform. But let me talk a little bit more about that in a second. Today, our tally is that about 130 school systems are implemented some sort of remote learning, but it's obviously very heterogeneous, I was saying, because there's an immense digital divide. And what you see in this is access to TV by school-age kids. And globally, we see that it's 62, for instance, 62% is access to TV. Only 24% having internet at home, and 16% having access to radio. I mean, this is not, but it's cheap, but it's less popular now. I don't have the data here of smartphones, but smartphones is even higher than radio in many cases. But if we look at the issue of internet, right, you can see that even in Latin America and East Asia, it's only 50% or 35% of kids who will have access to internet. In West and Central Africa, in Eastern Africa, is less than 10% who will have access to internet. So obviously, this dictates that any efforts of remote learning have to be, have to be multimodal. And that's actually what we see, right? In this graph, you see the share of countries responding to school closures with different types of remote learning. And in richer countries can obviously rely much more on online only, right? Or a combination of online and broadcast. But if you see upper middle income countries and lower middle income countries, even them, right, only a small share can rely only on online mechanisms. It's most of them has to have a multimodal remote learning platforms. So the one important thing is that we know that kids are being reached, not all, but many kids are being reached by a combination in remote learning, a combination of TV, radio, maybe online. But the challenge that we have today is knowing how much learning is happening, right? And actually on TV, we see data for some countries of very high ratings of the TV programs, which is great, right? I mean, actually the first news that we have about that we had about high ratings were in Spain, right? And that's great. But the question is, okay, but high ratings of TV doesn't mean that there's any learning. And unfortunately, only scattered data that we see is that in countries as diverse as Bangladesh and Belgium, right, we see that there are, I mean, Belgium, for instance, who is one of the few countries in which we have learning data post-pandemic, is that we see significant learning losses in all tested subjects, and a lot of inequality in those learning losses. I mean, within Belgium, right? Same thing in Bangladesh. National TV education programs. Yes, most kids are aware that they exist, but only half of those access choose to view it. So I mean, it's a high rating of half of them choose to see it, but it's not all, right? And same thing with some government provided online learning programs. Only 21% had access, but about 2%, right, of those with access are really using them intensively. So we need to work much more in terms of understanding, even if there's an offer of remote learning, right, how much usage of that remote learning is there and how much learning is happening out of that remote learning activities. And there, my sense is that until up to this stage, I don't think we have great news in terms of how much learning is really happening. Countries and systems are starting to open with caution, but even if by October, I mean, a larger number of countries have reopened in one way or the other, right? And that's what you see in these yellow countries. You have most of Latin America and most of South Asia and parts of Africa still closed, but a lot of countries have already opened. So I mean, if you remember the numbers that were calculated at the beginning of the pandemic around May, at some point we had 1.8 million kids out of school. The number has gone down. Now we have only, in quotes, 700 million of kids out of school. But one thing that we need to be cognizant is that several of these systems have had to, that opened before, have to delay reopenings or have to reverse policies. So I think, I mean, a good part of the world, we have to enter a mindset of living with the virus, right? And adjust policies and continue improving remote learning. Now, let me finalize with one, and now hopefully I'll take just only 5 more minutes. But there are a few things that are lessons of this pandemic, right? One is that there was a digital divide, and we need to close the digital divide. Second is that we need to strengthen the home learning environment. I mean, we knew that there was a digital divide and was not closed. And this pandemic has been kind of a slap in the face. Look, you didn't close the digital divide. Now you are living the consequences of that. If the digital divide would have been closed, things would have been better. Not great, but better. Second is the home learning environment has to be improved. The home matters a lot. There always have to be and will be continuity of the learning process between the school and the home. But obviously, poor children, right, who do not have the right space at home in order to learn, right, who do not have access to a device, who do not have supporting parents, or you have parents that will have many kids and cannot really pay attention to each one of them in order to foster their learning process. I mean, will be much harder for them to continue their learning process at home. And that's something that we need to work on. Countries now have, I think, the opportunity to build the foundations for the learning of the future, right? And that is something that if we think well, I mean, it's something that we can really attain if we start thinking how to use many of the investments that we are having today, right? In terms of closing the digital divide, which is happening, in terms of better training for teachers, which is happening, in terms of providing more support to parents and to communities, which is starting to happen in some countries. Maybe we can start building faster that learning experience of the future, right? And we need to continue thinking of what is the school of the future that we want, which is not a future of 20 years from now. It's a future that I think has been propelled or can be propelled to today, right? And if we think of what is that vision that we want, right, and let me mention it in 5 buckets, right? First, thinking about learners and the learning experience, right? I mean, having this idea of caring about, first of all, their overall well-being, and thinking that learning has to happen with joy, with purpose, with rigor, right? Which is very difficult for teachers, right? But that's actually what we strive to. And also thinking that learning implies fostering not only the physical and cognitive competencies, right, or the academics, but fostering social and emotional competence. I think that's one of the key lessons of this pandemic, right? That fostering emotional competencies and caring about the social emotional well-being of children is absolutely essential. So that's something that I think now could be better internalized by teachers and by parents. I think this crisis has also allowed us to recognize the importance of teachers. This crisis have allowed us to recognize that education is a social endeavor. But the teachers is not about academics. I mean, a lot of what teachers are doing through WhatsApp now is basically facilitating and coaching. And actually, that's what we want eventually with teachers, right? It's not about providing knowledge. It's about coaching, facilitating, supporting the teaching learning process in school and beyond. Teaching is about fostering academic and social and social emotional skills. And hopefully, this crisis is helping countries and helping people to value the work of teachers, right? And recognize that teaching has to be a socially valued career, right? And actually, that is what defines the successful education systems, right? Systems in which teaching is valued by everyone. We need to move in a vision in which learning environments, right, are flexible and dynamic, that we use a wide range of high tech and low tech, right? We need we need to we need to use I'm sorry, we need to use um, uh, we need to use high tech um, investments, but we cannot forget books, right? I mean, this is really a combination of high technology with say low tech with low technology. We need to invest in learning environments that have effective pedagogical practices, and when we talk about learning environments, we need to also think about not only the school but also the home and the community. Safe and inclusive schools, right? That's another part of the vision that we need for the future or for the near future, right? Policies, mechanisms, and training for key actors to make sure that children are safe from violence and abuse. That is something that now is central to the World Bank approach. That I mean, obviously we need to care about the curriculum, we need to care about about pedagogical practices, etc. But if kids do not feel safe at school, school is an extremely important socializing space for kids. But if they don't feel safe from violence and abuse, no learning will happen ever. We need to think of this whole school approach in terms of inclusion, in terms of making sure that kids with any type of disabilities have access to the right education service. And finally, part of that vision is investing in school leaders and principals that are pedagogical leaders, that are mentor teachers, that engage with the wider community. Sometimes we forget the management aspect of education is absolutely central, right? And many of you have experiences in school systems that would have showed you that, I mean, you go to two schools, when you have a great principal that really engages their teachers and the community, you have a much better instructional process. So these 5 pillars, right? Learners, teachers, learning spaces, schools that are safe and inclusive, education systems that are well managed with the right school leaders. If we work in these 5 with these 5 pillars, we can have the learning of the future that our kids deserve, right? A lot we need to work in terms of having well-functioning education systems, but it's not impossible to have this vision while we rebuild our education systems. And let me finish with this, and this is my last slide, Fernando. A few issues that we need to take into account when we rebuild our systems. First is that we need to continue pursuing systemic reform, right? That focuses on this holistic learning of caring not only about cognitive skills, but also social-emotional skills. But we're talking about not reforming a few schools, but all the reforms that we need in terms of teachers' careers, in terms of how to train teachers, how to reform the curriculum, how to reform management, etc., in order to have systemic reform. Second key principle is that equity is absolutely central. There's no successful system that at the same time is not equitable. Now, and we need to build a path, a progressive path towards universalism in all countries. But the issue, I think this issue of equity should be an obsession for all of us. Third principle is we need to measure what's going on. We need to measure results and base policy on evidence. Fourth principle, we need to harness technology, close the digital divide, but harness technology for all the possible aspects of education, of what happens in the classroom, what happens in the schools, what happens in terms of managing the system better. The use of technology can be much more aggressive. And final point, we need to assure that there is a financial and political commitment to reform, right? And that is commensurate to the magnitudes of the needs that we have, right? Everyone says that education is important, yes, all right, but the amount and degree of political commitment that is needed and financial commitment is needed, it is huge, and it's something that we really need to work intensively in each one of our countries. Thank you very much.
Jaime, this was excellent. Thank you very much. Let's open it up for questions. Use the participants, raise your hand or type something in the chat. But let me suggest, Jaime, that you take maybe 3 questions, then organize your thoughts and then answer. And let me begin, if I may.
Can I ask you a favor, Fernando?
Of course. Yes.
For some reason, I don't know if it's me, then I only see myself, but and that's something that I need to correct, or that you have to correct.
I don't know. I'm gonna see if that helps. Does that help?
No.
Do you see everybody or no? So I think this is,
yes. Now I can see everyone.
You can see it.
Now
so let me begin, Jaime. No, that's good. That's good. We've been here. We've been here all along. You have almost 100 people who are very, very attentive on a Saturday.
Great.
So Jaime, I have a question. I think there is tremendous value in this analytic work that you have shared that calculates essentially various different scenarios, right? And I think this notion of calculating counterfactuals is very, very important at this time. For example, if you look at the impact, the educational impact, well, if you look in health, it's very clear. You look at the number of people who have died per 100,000 across countries, you see huge differences. And then the question is what accounts for those differences? And one hypothesis is institutional differences and choices made by leaders. Real choices made by leaders make a big difference. Same is true for education. You look at Taiwan, they almost lost no classes. You look at places in China, they have recovered the classes that they lost. If the world had been able to learn from China and do what China did, we would not be in the dire situation you are predicting. And so the question is, what avenues do we have to get governments to act on the best knowledge, to use that information? Because it seems to me that we don't lack knowledge. I mean, if you just look around the world, you can see what needs to be done. But I don't know that we have the mechanisms to get, especially governments, to act on the best government. So maybe it's not a fair question, but think about it, because I'm sure that you must agonize over this. You must agonize over governments who decide we're just going to shut down the schools for a year. And you know that those are countries that are at the bottom of opportunity, and you can just foresee the social challenges that this is going to create. Anyway, let's take a couple of more questions. Paula, you raise your hand.
Is Paola me, Fernando? I don't know who.
Yes, that's you. That Paolo Celli. Yes, that's you.
Oh no, I hadn't raised my hand, but Jaime, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás?
I thought you did.
Hola.
Well, I'll ask a question given the opportunity, I think. So I was just wondering, Jaime, in your 5 big buckets, right, that you have delineated, how would you connect that with your learning poverty outcomes that you highlighted at the beginning? Sort of how are you thinking from these very big ideas to address truly the critical gaps that you see in literacy? If you could elaborate on that, you know. Great. Thanks, Fernando. I wasn't planning to, but thank you.
All right, let's take a couple of more questions. Aruj?
Thank you for your presentation. It's been so insightful. And as a teacher who has worked in Pakistan, I know that I was using WhatsApp schooling for my students because of an NGO. But government school teachers were not asked to reach out to students at all. There was no systemic instruction on the part of the government. So, and a lot of the dialogue on the ground has been, you know, we have so many things to focus on. People have lost their jobs. The government needs to provide rations. We need to make sure health is okay. And education hasn't been prioritized until, you know, now in some ways where schools are reopening and to the extent of a school television program. My question for you is, what challenges have you seen at the World Bank in aligning actors towards actually focusing on education, where they have all these competing concerns in the context of COVID?
Thank you. One last question on this round, and then we'll do another one. Kristen.
Hi, thank you so much for your speech and for being here. One of the points in the managing continuity phase was about the re-enrollment and dropout prevention. I was wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about what strategies you may suggest to address this, or what have some countries done well in order to address the dropout rate?
Okay, Jaime, over to you.
Okay, all easy questions. So, well, first I have to say hi to Paola, to Franco, Luciana, some of the Peruvians that I see in the screen. I mean, there might be others, right? But great to see you guys. Look, so as you were saying, Fernando, this really is something that does, to be frank, sometimes does not allow me to sleep at night, in the sense that I don't see the sense of urgency that should exist, right? On several, and with that, I wanted to answer both your question, but also the point in terms of the challenge is to focus on education, right? That Arush was making. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name well. Okay, good. And I don't see that. So on two fronts, what is that it is true, I mean, at the government level, it's understandable, right? Your first line of action is health, right? You need to cope with the pandemic. However, that is taking and will take long, right? I mean, it's not that, okay, it's a matter that there is going to be a vaccine tomorrow and immediately everyone will be vaccinated and this will be gone. That will not be the case, right? But we're understanding that only little by little, all right? This is a long time. We have noticed that look, this was not, we thought it was going to be only a few weeks, then only a few months, then now we don't know, right? And I think there has been a very slow realization about how much kids are losing already, right? And I think, I mean, with all the people that you have here, right, and with this community, Fernando, and with, I mean, and we need to try to be as vocal as possible. We have tried in the bank. Actually, these simulations help, right? Because just, I mean, just let's put numbers out there that show the potential losses that we could have. But I don't think it's ever enough. So one is in terms of making sure that both globally but more important, right, at the country level, right, there is an understanding that kids are losing. And I think this is just a magnification of the crisis that we already had, right? And as opposed to health, in education, nobody dies, right? So it's not a crisis that you really see it in your face, right? It's a silent crisis, right? That happens little by little, but actually you're killing the future of many kids, right? But you don't see that, right? It's much more complicated to see it. Now, but so related to the point that Aruj was saying, some countries realized faster, right, that they had to, for instance, give tools to teachers, or that make teachers accountable for the work that they had to do remotely. Some countries have done it better than others, right? Peru has not done it bad. Peru has done it well. They have really pushed the teachers, and at some point, teachers are saying, "Well, come on. I mean, that they only have 12 hours, right? And it's too complicated, right? Probably not all teachers. There will be some who are not doing a great job, but many are. Many of them are. But there was a very strong signal from the ministry, right? In other countries, we have not seen that. Same thing applies to the opening process, which I think it's what you are referring, Fernando, which is that we need to have a sense of urgency, right? On one hand, to say, look, I mean, we need to make sure that kids are not disengaged, right? And related to Kristen's question, right? We need to have communications campaigns to, you know, in order to reduce dropout rates. We have to use cash transfer programs in order to give an incentive, right? Particularly for girls to come back to school, because you have two impacts on the dropout rate. One is the plain economic impact, right? I mean, kids have to go to work, because the family does not have income. But on the other hand, you have this educational effect of kids having been disengaged, right? And so kids who were kind of the brink of not really getting too much of what's happening in school, right? After 4 months of complete disengagement, they're out, and they might not be back at all, right? So there are, it's either money, right, economic incentives, or communications campaign that have to be intensive. But second, this sense of urgency of when to come back, right? I've seen different countries say, let me take a close example here of Chile, right, in which we supported the Minister of Education, because he was very adamant of saying we need to go back as soon as possible. It's not saying let's be irresponsible and let's go back even if infection rates are high. But given that infection rates are going down, and are going down faster in some areas of the country than in others, well, let's go back there, right? It's what Uruguay did. Uruguay went back faster in rural areas because infection rates were very low. Okay, so let's go back to school, right? And later urban areas. Other countries, right, have given up, right? So Kenya, Bolivia, to different extent, have said, look, see you next year, right? We'll try to do, Kenya is saying, well, we'll try to do something remote. Bolivia basically said, see you next year. Nothing, we're not gonna do anything, right? With the excuse that they cannot reach everyone through internet, which is true, right? But okay, but let's do what we can, right? Let's distribute books, right? If you cannot reach internet. But at the same time, let's be prepared to go back as soon as possible, right? That sometimes is confused by some people. Say, oh, so the World Bank is pushing that we need to go back even and be irresponsible. Say, no, I mean, you're not an idiot. I mean, if infection rates are extremely high, you cannot go back. Most likely in Argentina, in Colombia, in Peru, maybe you cannot go back today, true, right? But let's be prepared to go back as soon as we can, right? We cannot say, let's wait for the vaccine, because that could be a year. right? And the amount of losses of kids is just too big. That's my worry. Very quickly responding to Paola's, which is a question that, I mean, we required another presentation to answer, but basically those 5 pillars are the message that I wanted to give, and maybe it was not that clear, is we have the outcome, right? And what we need to push countries is to look, you need to focus on, first of all, an outcome, right? It's not a matter of just throwing inputs and just buy laptops or invest in some teachers training. Is we need to move the needle. We need to focus on the outcome. Now, for that to happen, yes, you need to have all these ingredients, right? But you need to have it in a coherent way and at the same time, right? Because sometimes people say, well, we invest on this or in that or in that. Well, that's not the case, right? You cannot invest in technology if you invest in teachers, right? It's just wasting your money buying laptops if you don't invest in teachers having digital skills at the same time, right? And none of them will work if you don't have a good school leader that will organize the whole process, right? So our message is that you need to work on those 5 areas and those 5 pillars simultaneously and in a coherent fashion in order to move the needle. Let me stop there at this point, Fernando.
That's good. Let's get 3 more questions. Andrea, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Andrea, there you go.
Hi. Thank you so much, Jaime. I really appreciated both your talk and the slides that you prepared as well, especially the buckets you had at the end, the second to last slide. I had 2 questions. Number 1, you made a specific reference to supporting learning environments at home, I think is how you worded it. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what your thoughts on that, improving learning environments at home. And also you made a comment around strengthening capacity for principals to develop stronger cultures for learning within how they're drivers for their school culture, but how that becomes significantly more complicated in the remote environment.
Thank you. Let's take a few, Jaime. Amelia?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation, Jaime. It's really insightful. Just curious, what factors are used to determine the expected impact on learning poverty as a result of COVID? And then what steps would you recommend for a country to take to reduce the worst case scenarios? And are there different recommendations you'd recommend based on region, like Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa, or Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Can you repeat the first question? It was too fast. Can you
I'm sorry. Yes. What factors are used to determine the expected impact on learning poverty as a result of COVID?
Okay.
Jose?
Hola, Fernando. Hola, Jaime. I actually have a question about something that Jaime already mentioned, but I want to hear a little bit more about his opinion. Something that we've implemented at the Ministry of Education of Peru. I'm also from Peru.
Hola, Jose.
One of the things that Jaime mentioned is that we have implemented various tools to assure accountability from teachers. So we have used some online forms and things that teachers have to fill out like every week, and they have to give them to principals. And I've had some issues with that because that's something that I haven't been completely in agreement with at the point that it has been taken to, because we've also received a lot of complaints from principals, from teachers, because this also means a lot of overload of work, even in this context where they already have a lot of additional work because they have to get in contact with students in a completely different context than what they're usually used to. So I want to hear about your opinion about that, and maybe if there's some other strategies that we could use instead of thinking about these like conventional, like filling out paperwork. Even if they're online, they're still like, they still use time that teachers could be using to be working with their students, right? Thank you.
Jaime, why don't you take these 3 and then we'll take one last round of 3 questions, okay? So those of you who are the top 3, I think I already have them. There you go.
Great.
Go ahead, Jaime.
Thanks, Jose, and for that last question as well. So let me take that last one, but to reflect on one thing, and to a certain extent, I think I'm very happy of not being minister in this moment, because it's so complicated to do the right thing when you have to try, right? So we're doing things that we have never done, right? So imagine if we would have thought in normal times of saying, okay, let's use WhatsApp for teachers to communicate with their students, or let's use WhatsApp intensively to formally, not as friends, but formally communicate the ministry or the principal with the teachers to see what they are doing. Probably we would have taken a 2-year pilot program, right? An impact evaluation to see if really that works, right? What's the impact on the workload of teachers? What's the impact of mental health? What's the impact on learning of that attempt of using WhatsApp to communicate, right? Which would have been an interesting, bold program, right? The poor minister who would have proposed that to do that would have received a lot of criticism from a lot of people, and maybe not of others. With this pandemic, countries have had to do that in an official way in weeks, right? And weeks, so I have teachers at home. I have to pay them. So how do I know if they are working, right? And this is public money, right? So I pay them to do something, right? Before, at least I knew if they were there because I knew they were going to school, right? Still, we had the problem of if they go to school, were they teaching? Or were they teaching effectively? Big question, right? But at least I know I can use that public money to pay them because I saw them there, right? Now I'm going to use that public money from taxes. I pay you. I have no clue what you're doing, right? So people would have said, look, you need to find a way of knowing that, right? First attempt, as you are describing, I would have also thought, look, that's too much for teachers. It's too much of a workload, right? But I think this is a process in which we'll need to learn to try things, make mistakes, do something else, maybe make another mistake and do something else. And we need to get used to trying and failing and learning, right? At a very fast pace, right? And actually that's something that we have always asked education systems, right? You need to be bolder, right? You need to try new things. And if they fail, well, you correct and do something else, right? I think this pandemic is pushing us to do things that we have never done, right? And I agree with you. I mean, the way the ministry did it in Peru was just too much, right? So we'll need to find the right dose of accountability. There has to be some accountability. How do you assure accountability online, right? In some work environments, that's easy. Or there's a culture of working online, so it's easier to have the accountability, or depending on the product, it's easy to have accountability. We are learning how to have accountability of online teaching. That we're learning, right? And that had to be done at scale and in a few weeks. That's very tough, right? So I would say, well, let's keep on learning. I don't have the solution to the proven solution. I don't have it, obviously. I've never been in a pandemic. I've never had 500,000 teachers working online simultaneously. That never happened, right? So we just don't know. So let's be. I think the lesson I want to derive from your question is that we need just to be open and flexible to try, fail, and try again. The issue of principles is absolutely critical. The point I wanted to make there is that they're not all systems. There is the real recognition, right? That the principal can define the spirit of the school, right? And if you have a principal that really motivates his or her workforce in the school, you can make a huge difference even with the same material resources that the school can have. So we do not see in every education system the right investments in terms of giving principals the managerial and leadership capacities that they need, right? So that's a key element. And finally, the two points. One is in terms of the factors that we used for the simulations that Amelia was asking. This is really a simulation because we're doing these scenarios depending on the offer that exists of remote. So first of all is the extent of the school closures. So that's one the most important factor. But then there comes the parameters about the mitigation effects. So the mitigation is if there is remote learning, right? And there we know the offer, right? We know if there is an offer of TV and radio. In some countries, we know if there is usage, right? And the better parameters that we have, the more information we have more precise simulations. If we know the usage of TV or radio, in some countries we do. In other countries, we're just asking the authorities, what do you think it is, right? Or our test managers, what do you think is that usage? And the final is a guess about effectiveness in terms of learning, right? And actually, to be frank, our parameters are moving down, right? With a little information that starts trickling in terms of how much kids are really learning. We don't, I mean, in terms of cognitive or social emotional skills, at this stage we have guesses, but as information comes in, I'm being less optimistic at this stage. And one final point on learning environments, very quickly, that could be a large discussion, but our point is that, look, we need to fight inequality of opportunities because the schools are different, right? The schools should be the most equalizing factor, right? Ideally, we need to strive to have that to any school you go, you have the right to go independently of your income, and you get the same quality of schooling everywhere in the country. That's not happening. We need to fight on that. However, a good chunk of the learning process happens at home. And there's a huge unequalizing force, right, that we're not fighting, because it's true, a rich kid or a middle-class kid will have supportive parents, will have a desk, will have books. Well, we'll see, maybe in some cases, we'll see less violence, right, and have a more nurturing space, while another kid will have violence at home, will have no books, right? We'll have parents that are not educated. We'll have parents who have to work and do not have time to devote, to give them the right stimulation. So those differences at home are just too big, right? And we need to be cognizant that they do have a real impact on learning. The school can compensate. Yes, it can compensate, but not completely, and not in all cases. So, I mean, we can do from the more complex, and that's something that we need trying to put more in our World Bank operations, is support directly to parents, right? To just give them more information about what the kid is doing, how can they help the kids. We sometimes think that parents will know, and that is wrong, right? Some parents know, other parents don't know, but can learn, right? On how to provide a better space a better environment to their kids. And the other thing is that programs to provide books at home are critical, right? I mean, in Estonia, kids have books. It's not that the tablet will solve everything. You need to have books. You have to be reading material at home, right? And that could be public policy. We're not using public policy for that. That could be done.
Let's take the last 3 questions. I know we're over time. I'll ask each of one of them to try to keep them to 30 seconds or less, okay? Murali.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. So the impact of there is so much of diversity and heterogeneity in the impact of COVID and the solutions on that. So my question is, are there any specific policy recommendations for the early childhood group or the pre-primary, given that some of the online solutions, there are huge apprehensions of their applicability to it? So what policy recommendations for early childhood care and education? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Murali. Aditi.
Hi, Jaime. Thank you for your presentation. My question is on access to technology to ensure greater uptake of the online learning that's being made available increasingly so by government. So, what are your thoughts on how we can increase in some ways access to a smartphone or internet connection, because it looks like that could be one factor that equalizes, that acts as an equalizer in some sense, at least in the next few months. But there's been very little that we know on programs that work in terms of just providing a hardware which could be used for anything else aside from education. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on successful programs.
Thank you, Helen. Helen.
Thank you. My question is on foundational literacy. Jaime, I'm really saddened by the 63% you shared about kids cannot read after COVID by 10. So if you were in some context where we only have 30 days of after reopening for a semester, when we try to convince the government of let's only do foundational literacy or foundational numeracy courses, the national government are resistant in what about our syllable courses? So if you were to convince, say, Minister of Education, Nigeria, what would you, how would you convince them, hey, let's do this remedial courses first before we can talk about other?
Thank you, Helen. Over to you, Jaime.
Thank you, Fernando. It would be great also if we would have time, or maybe I'll try to connect a bit later to see what you guys know in terms of your experiences in your countries. I mean, there's a wealth of knowledge here that I've not that I would like to absorb.
I'd love to invite you in my class on policy. I have 2/3 of the students are doing projects with governments on this issue, and there is a book coming out of that. You can be sure. But we'll talk about that. Anyway, go ahead.
I'll be happy to do that. This is another book, Fernando. I don't know how you do that. I mean, I need to learn your technology, man, because I mean,
it's never do things alone. Always with good collaborators.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that. But actually, Fernando has made me written. I mean, have made me write. I mean, I always said I had to write a little bit about the experience in Peru. I have a book that is, I mean, it's still in my laptop there, but at least you made me, okay, write a chapter. So, I mean, Fernando gave me a deadline. So, okay, so I wrote a chapter. So that was good. I really appreciate that. So look, so Murali, I will say, if you send me an email, I'll send you the, we have just had a note a few days ago that our team did on what to do in terms of early childhood policies. I just want to share now that it's a huge worry because the closures there have been basically universal, and it's I mean, you can reach a little bit with TV, yes, but that's it, right? There is very little that you can do online, or that you can do to WhatsApp, or that you can learn in terms of directed learning in a way that you might be able to do with secondary education kids, which has its own challenges. But here, a lot of the stimulation for early child education, it's play, right? It's interaction, right? It's socialization, right? It's much. I mean, my sense of early child education is much less about academics. It's much more about a living experience. So it's much more complicated. And the one thing that we can do is support the caregiver, right? Is support parents, support grandparents, right? To try to give some of that stimulation and some of that play opportunities. Pratham in India has been very active on that, on try to foster how to give tips to parents of games that they can do at home, which might sound like simple things, but they could be potentially very effective, right? And can change the experience that children are having during this lockdown. But it's, for me, also another argument of this sense of urgency, right? That it's not like okay, so let's wait for the vaccine and see you in 2 years, and that's it. I think what kids are losing under child education is immense. We haven't done, I mean, all the calculations that I have shown do not include early child education. They're not included there, right? And we can do that. Our team hasn't done those calculations, but just remember that we have been saying for many years already that the highest social return, right, and the marginal dollar should go to pre-primary education, right? We have saying that for a long time, right? The highest social investment, the highest return in social investment is the early years, and then primary, and then secondary, and then higher, right? The private returns to higher education can be high, but in terms of social returns, we have been saying that it's basic education and even pre-primary. So if that were true, then the social losses of these kids not going to early child education are immense. So that's a huge worry for us. In terms of the issue of access to technology, Aditi, I think the point is that there are many fronts to this, right? So having technology that works, have many ingredients. It is the devices. It is the digital technology, digital skills of teachers. It is the software, right? It is connectivity, right? We need at least those issues simultaneously, right? If you solve only one, you don't have anything. You solve it, but don't have the work. You solve everything, but do not have the right details on those four. Some countries are, but in terms of the kind of a few quick wins, is countries that we see of assuring that you consume any data, you don't have to pay if you download things from educational websites or from the ministry website. Data plans for teachers, we have seen that in many countries, so that teachers receive a code, and with that, they can have free access in their smartphones, and they don't pay anything. So there are some things that can be done, or subsidies to buy a smartphone, or to buy a tablet. Some for poor kids, which is not easy in the right direction. Now they are costly. They should imply a permanent new line in the budget, right? And that's something that ministers of finance not necessarily like, but that's the way to go. And just to finalize, what you were mentioning, Helen, is that what we need to work with countries is say, look, there's a battery of things, a menu of things that have to happen, right? You need to do remedial learning. You need to do to make changes in the school calendar. You need to simplify curriculum. Most likely, you need to do all of them, right? Some cases would choose some, others would choose others. Most likely, I will do everything. I completely agree with you that we need to be pragmatic and say, look, kids will not be able to cover the whole curriculum, such as life, but let's make sure that they have the foundational skills. And governments have to be convinced of that. Some are at this stage, some aren't, right? But the smart governments are working on on all margins, right? They're saying, okay, the school year might not be finishing now in December, might have to go until May of next year. The next school year will have to start later. And so instead of having 2 school years of 10 months, you will have 2 school years of 7 months each, right? With a simplified curriculum, right? With less hours in the school. And you don't have any choice but being pragmatic. But I completely see your points that some countries in a way are a little bit resistant to that, but I think eventually reality will hit, right? And countries will have to work on all margins. But it's a huge homework for all of us here.
Jaime, I wanted to thank you very much for taking time on a Saturday morning to be with us. But I also want to thank you because I have heard you at a number of meetings express that same sense of urgency and that pain. It's very clear that you feel that slow death in the lives and the opportunities of many children. And I think what you're doing is very important. Take care of yourself. I don't think that losing sleep is going to be very helpful. So stay healthy because we need you to keep exercising your good leadership. Thank you so very much for being with us today. And we can organize that meeting anytime to tell you what we're learning about other places.
Yeah,
so please join me in thanking Jaime for this. And now I'm going to turn it over to Felipe, who's going to tell us, I know that I'm late. I've done a terrible job as moderator. Felipe, tell us, how do we catch up and where do we go now?
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Fernando.
Gracias, Felipe. Gracias, Fernando.
Gracias.
Over the next 2 hours, we have a set of 6 different IEP showcases presentations. A wide variety of graduates will be presenting their work. So I invite you to visit the webpage, the conference webpage, decide which sessions do you want to go to, and we'll meet back again here in the main hall in 2 hours for our next keynote speaker. Thank you so much for being here, and if you need any support, let us know.
Felipe, do you want to say a word about how people can contribute to this Google document that you have created?
Yeah, so we've created this outcome statement with the purpose of collecting takeaways and collecting
Maybe
thoughts.
You can put on the chat room, you can put a link.
I just did. It's
Yeah.
right there. We would invite you to open it up, keep it open as you hear more presentations, as more questions come up, as more thoughts and insightful ideas arise as we continue the conversation, and record them there. This will be incredibly helpful for the work that the planning committee has done, and also for a lot of the follow-ups that will come out of this gathering. So I invite you to contribute there, and let us know if we can be helpful in any way.
Felipe, thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you in the breakout rooms.